Good evening from the building of the New York City Bar Association. It's so exciting to be here because we've only been open. New York has lifted both the vaccination and mask mandate. And so we're gathered here together. Looking forward to being able to do more in-person events, although virtual is great because we get to talk to all of you throughout the region. I am Antonia Stolper of Council at Sherman and Sterling and Vice Chair for Latin America of the Vance Center for International Justice Committee of the New York City Bar Association. I'm also a member from the United States of the Lawyers Council for Civil and Economic Rights of the Vance Center. And it's the Lawyers Council that's sponsoring this program and has sponsored the Latin American Anti-Corruption Assessment. We have simultaneous English-Spanish translation, so I ask you to choose the option you prefer. Our panelists here at the Bar Association, I think, are going to speak in English, but I know it's going to be a mix from our colleagues from around the region. Tenemos traducción simultánea inglés-español. Está disponible seleccionando la opción Zoom. Thanks to our translators, Ana and Raul. Welcome to the second launch. This is the Latin American Anti-Corruption Assessment 2021-2022. And this is a regional study for 17 countries. Last year, we only managed, I believe, 8. The MAP's legal efforts to prevent and combat corruption. The link to the report is appearing in the chat. And please don't hesitate to blog in the chat as you hear folks talk today. Also, all publicity is welcome, so we would love your help in spreading the word and talking to your various media about this survey. The dramatic expansion to most of the countries in the region is something we're very, very proud of. And it's important to remember how this study works. This is not a study that focuses on the perception of corruption. So it's not like Transparency International's perception of corruption, how people feel about corruption. We're really drilling down on the legal framework. Now, the legal framework doesn't tell you everything, and Todd's going to talk a little about that in just a minute. But this at least provides the actual building blocks of an anti-corruption exercise. And that means understanding the legislation. It means understanding who's in charge of the anti-corruption efforts and who and what is implementing both prevention measures, reporting, and other such, and then prosecuting corruption. So that's a whole range of different actors in each country, and it's a huge range of sort of legal framework that has proved challenging for the region to implement. This study is the result of a collaboration on the ground of many different members of the legal profession in country, including members of law firms, and in particular, members of our Lawyers Council, companies, general counsels, and their lawyers inside their companies, academia, civil society, human rights defenders, judges, and interviews with appropriate actors in the anti-corruption effort. So this really brings together the legal profession as a profession to talk about these issues. Our Lawyers Council of the New York City of the Vance Center brings together lawyers who work in the private sphere throughout our hemisphere to promote the rule of law, anti-corruption, support of civil society, promotion of judicial independence. We have a number of different projects. We urge you to go to our website and see what we're doing. It's all in support of lawyers acting as promoters of justice and actors and lawyers being civil society actors in the defense of justice, human rights, democracy, freedom of expression. And the anti-corruption effort is a key element to a functioning civil society. So the study focuses on efforts to prevent, investigate, and punish corruption from the point of view of lawyers. And we think that it's important to understand what is on the ground today in the effort to fight corruption, and what the building blocks are in each country to move forward in the fight against corruption. There isn't anybody, and certainly no lawyer, who thinks corruption is a good idea. And so mobilizing the legal profession in this effort seems to us as lawyers, as part of the New York City Bar, to be really a very important exercise. Our Todd Kreider, partner at Simpson, Thacher and Bartlett, and with me, the other US representative to the Lawyers Council, is going to talk a little more in depth about what it means to implement the findings of this program. Todd.
Thank you, Antonia, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you, Antonia. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you, those of you who are here in person and those who are with us virtually. This is a timeless story of heroic virtue, winning against all odds, followed by the empire striking back, here in the form of rollbacks of prosecutorial activity and a conspicuous absence of non-politically motivated investigations. You could say that there was a Prague Spring that morphed into reinstatement of stasis, prosecutorial inactivity, and a steady state of impunity. In Brazil, the Lava Jato task force, perhaps the heroic virtue I referred to, was disbanded in February 2021. And in February 2022, the Supreme Court greatly narrowed the use of preventive arrest, which had compelled white-collar cooperation and plea bargaining that had always been missing in Brazil. In Mexico, AMLO reduced the pay and resources of Mexican institutions, and rhetorical attacks on corruption have only served to emphasize the gap between that rhetoric and actual prosecutions for corruption. In Guatemala, the International Commission Against Impunity was disbanded in 2019 after 12 years of unprecedented and courageous efforts. In Peru, other than former presidents under house arrest, successful white-collar prosecutions are almost non-existent. This report focuses the spotlight on the tragic gap between largely successful efforts by OECD and others to establish in many jurisdictions statutes that check all the boxes without a commensurate level of investment in the agencies to make those laws effective. Corruption obviously remains one of the major global challenges for national development, human well-being, and rule of law. It affects enjoyment of civil and economic rights. It generates discrimination in the implementation of public policies. It contributes to the violation of human and economic rights, undermining the capacity of law-abiding authorities to carry out their functions in full. Estimates of the impact of corruption on growth vary widely and vary between countries, but for many countries in Latin America, it's 2 to 5% annually. This is experienced as a tax on public works as projects are not bid out or bid out to a closed club, resulting in massive budgets relative to private sector comparables. Its experience is deferred or non-public works, too much money never reaching its intended uses. Its experience is defective construction that quickly deteriorates, and as a failure of the government to protect its citizenry. Some examples: when killers are known of journalists or environmental defenders, corruption impedes arrest or prosecution. Rainforest Foundation US, with whom we have cooperated, worked with indigenous peoples to coordinate the police arrest of illegal loggers. Within days, these men were released. Large public works for the Brazilian World Cup were deferred until a normal bid process was impossible, resulting in no bid contracts and allegedly grand-scale corruption. Simple permitting is held up in countries and businesses are forced to pay or remain idle. Impunity for violence lead to mafia-style protection rackets as in cities where only certain businesses are favored or allowed with massive markups relative to what they should be. Corruption has a significant impact on governments and public spaces in Latin America, and I would argue a legalized form of corruption through bought influence here in the United States. So it's routinely one of the largest and most complex problems that is identified by citizenry. As a result, the fight against corruption has become a rhetorical priority in the public agenda, but this rhetorical emphasis has led to a massive discrepancy between the rhetoric and reality. Other known consequences: low confidence in the state, lower tax collection, underinvestment in infrastructure, lower private sector confidence, flight of international capital. As you know, private investors pick a country in part based on rule of law and protections available, including the feasibility of mitigating state corruption and the protection of the court system. These risks then lead to investment in other countries or often flight of investors once they realize how weak the rule of law is. In this report, I want to quickly tick through some of the main takeaways. One, no significant progress was detected in countries analyzed in the prior evaluation in 2020. On the contrary, there were meaningful setbacks of independence and capacity in, among others, Mexico, Guatemala, and Peru. There was a significant regression or lack of progress in anti-corruption enforcement in large countries, including Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. There has been a lack of political will to match legislation with policies to strengthen institutions and their capacity to implement rules, including providing prosecutorial and judicial independence and sufficiently sophisticated resources and financial resources. And many of the countries analyzed, the legal community considers that the authorities lack independence and capacity. Uruguay and Chile, two of the countries that are best qualified, that are best reviewed in our report, are not countries that have the most robust legal framework. This doesn't mean that the legislation is not important. What it means is that it's not enough. Effective use of imperfect tools is more effective than not using perfect tools. Many anti-corruption efforts are focused on penalizing, but not on establishing effective mechanisms to prevent or report corruption. Prevention policies in the public sector, if they exist, are very weak and ineffective. The potential of whistleblower incentives, a major driver of anti-corruption efforts in the United States, is very ineffective. And often, while there are whistleblower laws in many countries, there are not commensurate incentives to whistleblowers. In most countries, there is no regulation to establish anti-corruption mechanisms for private sector companies. And if there are no guidelines for compliance or monitoring. This contrasts with companies that are subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act from the United States, which has contributed meaningfully to growing efforts in the private sector across the region for companies that are international in scale or have US nexus or ownership or financing activities. The FCPA, I think, has had a very positive effect in improving compliance efforts in larger corporations in the region. The mechanisms for appointing prosecutors and judges in the region are often political and are not based on merit or capacity of individuals. Civil society requires more support in anti-corruption efforts and has struggled to turn anti-corruption sentiment into effective political will to force change. Obviously, as is so often the case, it is people in poverty and vulnerable conditions who are most affected by corruption. The recommendations in the report are set forth by country and at the regional level as calls to action from the legal community to meet the challenges mentioned. I would like to highlight a couple. There are 3 rules, they say, to real estate investing: location, location, location. And as to anti-corruption, I would argue there are 3 rules as well: political will, political will, political will. And following this through with prosecutorial resources that make that will effective by allocating sufficient resources to authorities willing and able to prosecute, to investigate and prosecute wrongdoing, and who benefit from support from the government. Another point that is critical is the need for involvement of the private sector in each country and at the regional level in order to promote the efforts of the legal community in the matter of anti-corruption and the efforts of civil society. Too often we've seen in the region efforts of civil society undercut often by legislation or even repression that's directed at civil society organizations, seeking to neuter them in terms of their ability to have a favorable impact on these matters. These efforts and these issues are not peripheral, but they're central to the rule of law, and the rule of law is central to development. This report is in part a response from lawyers in the private sector across our hemisphere to this ongoing crisis of corruption and impunity, and therefore legitimacy. We're grateful for your presence, for your interest, and urge you to join these efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. Tremendous summary of the challenges that lie ahead of all of us in the region to make these efforts a reality. I once again want to emphasize that the report itself is in the chat. It's in Spanish and in English, and some of it is in Portuguese. Now we're actually going to delve into the specifics of the report. We've got 3 topics: legislation, authorities, and implementation. We have an amazing panel. Obviously, we're not covering all of the countries for all of the topics, but the opportunity to sort of touch on all of these areas in a broad brush fashion, we hope you will find very interesting. And again, please blog in the chat. Jaime Chavez-Alor, who's our policy director for Latin America and the policy director for the Lawyers Council, and who has shepherded this program through the last 2 years, is going to both introduce the general findings for each of the topics and is going to moderate the panel. The panels, I did it last year and I think he will do a better job. So over to you, Jaime.
Thank you very much, Antonia. And it has been a privilege for me to work on the Lawyers Council for Civil and Economic Rights in this very important project. I just want to highlight 5 topics for the first part of our discussion, which is legislation. I'm going to underscore some of the important things Todd already mentioned. So the first point is that the information shows that in most countries, they're having efforts to update the anti-corruption legislation. However, legislative efforts alone are not enough. The second is, in general terms, legal frameworks are aimed at punishing corruption rather than establishing an effective mechanism to prevent corruption, both in the public and private sectors. Third, in most countries, the rules for the prevention of corruption concerning the public sector are focused on the executive branch, and there are no corresponding obligations in the legislative and judicial branch. Fourth, in most Latin American countries, The rules that sanction corruption are concentrated in criminal law, and we don't have that many regulation on administrative and civil law. This is important because it makes it hard to repair damages, consequences of acts of corruption. And number 5 is that in the private sector, most of the regulation to prevent corruption is inadequate or it doesn't exist. The legal community identified the lack of specificity of guidelines for compliance and verification. And without further ado, let's hear from our panelists this afternoon. I'm going to introduce them, the 4 of them at the same time for this legislation part, so that we can keep the conversation fluid. So first we have Adriana Bueno from Colombia, partner of Gomez Pinzón. We have Leonel Perez Nieto from Mexico, partner at Krill, Garcia Cuellar, Aiza, and Enriquez. We have Pilar Callizo from Paraguay and Sergio Matos from Peru. I'm sorry, Pilar from Gross Brown and Sergio Matos from Rebasa, Alcázar y de las Casas. Adriana, please.
Hola, buenas tardes. Hi, everybody. On behalf of Gomez Pinzón, thank you, Vance Central Lawyers Council and New York City Bar for this invitation. I'm very honored to be here and I'm going to start. Como lo indica, pues esta evaluación de anticorrupción y como se ha dicho en el inicio del panel, Colombia específicamente tiene bastante normatividad en el sector para reglamentar en el sector público y en el sector privado. Y hay suficientes medidas, en mi opinión, para prevenir y luchar contra la corrupción y pues con todo este tema de campo de acción para ejecutar. Sin embargo, pues hay medidas en el sector público. Se cuenta con estatuto anticorrupción, con más de 10 leyes relacionadas con comportamiento ético de funcionarios públicos. Hay temas en contratación pública, hay medidas como un código único disciplinario, procedimientos para identificar y gestionar conflictos de interés. Hay políticas para recepción de regalos y atenciones, hay obligaciones en cuanto a las inhabilidades también para ejercer cargos públicos, para contratar con el Estado, políticas de capacitación en anticorrupción. Desde el año 2016, las empresas del sector privado ya tienen obligaciones para implementar programas de transparencia y ética empresarial, cumpliendo unos requisitos en cuanto a activos e ingresos. En los años 2020 y 2021 el espectro se cambió, se incluyeron empresas en diferentes sectores de la economía, en empresas que celebran también contratos con el Estado colombiano. También se menciona que en Colombia que la responsabilidad de las empresas respecto de los actos de corrupción es administrativa y no penal. Se controla a través de sanciones administrativas con inhabilidades en procesos de contratación, y sin perjuicio pues, de la responsabilidad penal que tengan los funcionarios o los administradores o los mismos oficiales de cumplimiento y revisores fiscales que participen en actos de corrupción. Esta nueva ley que salió en el año 2022, que es la ley 2195, pues ha establecido unas medidas adicionales sancionatorias para combatir los actos de corrupción y de funcionarios públicos y de los administradores y empleados de las empresas del sector real, entre otros aspectos. Y a pesar de toda esa cantidad de legislación que hay en Colombia, pues hay muy poca acción de los organismos del Estado y de la empresa privada para combatir y penalizar la corrupción. Y existe una escasa supervisión y control sobre el cumplimiento de pues, lo que es la legislación que se aplica. La implementación, por ejemplo, de programas de ética y transparencia empresarial, pues ha tenido muchos cambios en poco tiempo, es costosa para las compañías, son cortos los plazos para implementarlos y hay exigencias en cuanto al nombramiento del compliance officer, a quien se le ha establecido pues un perfil tan exigente que está dificultándose incluso en el país encontrar profesionales expertos en esta materia y nos hemos vuelto hasta famosos por el tema de quiénes son los más expertos y los que más saben. No existen mecanismos específicos para proteger a los denunciantes, como se dijo, o incentivos para denunciar, a pesar de que la legislación existe y obliga a implementarlos. También hay una alta percepción de corrupción, pues los organismos como, por ejemplo, Transparencia por Colombia, pues acaba de publicar un estudio donde dice que estamos ubicados en el puesto 78 sobre 180 países y que nuestro puntaje dentro del índice de corrupción es 39 sobre 100, siendo 100 pues limpio en corrupción, entonces estamos todavía muy lejos de llegar a ese punto, y pues a esto hay que sumarle que hay también una alta percepción de impunidad, pues porque hay falta de imparcialidad de los entes sancionadores y aquí los sistemas pues para designar los funcionarios públicos no generan independencia en los procesos sancionatorios, se trata de procesos que están permeados en gran mayoría por temas políticos y de conveniencia, y pues tampoco hay voluntad política, como también se dijo anteriormente, para ejecutarlos. No hay una continuidad en la asignación de recursos económicos y tecnológicos, en el nombramiento y permanencia de funcionarios públicos encargados de combatir la corrupción. Depende de todos estos procesos electorales, presupuestales, de la transparencia en el gasto público, de políticas de funcionarios de turno, y pues hay muchas entidades realizando esfuerzos separados en donde falta esa coordinación interinstitucional para poder poner en marcha acciones y para aplicar pues esa legislación. Y hay también un poco esa resistencia cultural para arraigar la corrupción pues, que está arraigada en las empresas, en las entidades e incluso en las distintas actividades cotidianas de nuestro pueblo colombiano. Hay sectores vulnerables que son mucho más, que se ven más son factores que pueden beneficiar esos actos corruptos por el tema de comunidades indígenas, afrodescendientes, hasta los migrantes ya están incluidos en este estudio y pues obviamente son factores que impiden tener una cultura más transparente y ética. Y obviamente para mejorar, pues y las recomendaciones que se dan en la evaluación pues son uno, pues tratar de articular esa normatividad que existe, que es bastante y suficiente para que fortalezcamos las instituciones estatales, para empezar pues a tratar de evitar las prácticas corruptas y desincentivarlas y empezar a sancionar realmente. Hace unos días hubo la primera sanción por temas de soborno transnacional para una entidad que es aseguradora. Eso es muy bueno, ya empezar a ver ese tipo de sanciones. También realizar más esfuerzos para que las empresas pues sepan cuál es la legislación aplicable y que no haya esa confusión de qué me aplica, qué no me aplica. Entonces tratar de ser un poco más concretos en qué me aplica y cuáles son mis obligaciones como empresa. Y también pues establecer mecanismos para que los organismos encargados de luchar contra la corrupción pues tengan más recursos, más estabilidad, más imparcialidad en las decisiones, modificar esos procesos de designación de funcionarios para que no haya pues ese tema de favoritismos, etcétera, y establecer mecanismos para reglamentar, pues incentivar y proteger a sus denunciantes de los actos corruptos. En mi opinión, la ley 2195, que es nueva, pues ahora tiene que ser un mecanismo que logre combatirla realmente con sanciones específicas. Solo espero que no sea otro esfuerzo legislativo lleno de leyes, pero que no tiene acción, que no tenga una aplicación en la práctica. Y por eso yo creo que todos tenemos que aportar, la sociedad civil, los mismos abogados, los diferentes estamentos públicos y privados y todos los ciudadanos, pues para que podamos empezar a identificar esas prácticas corruptas, para utilizar los mecanismos y las herramientas que ahorita existen y que las sanciones puedan ser realmente una realidad y que las acciones para evitar la corrupción sean parte de nuestra cultura como país. Muchísimas gracias.
Should I
Leonel,
continue or?
sí, please,
Okay,
thank you.
thank you. Thank you. And it's good. It's good. Well, I don't know if it's good, but it's enlightening to see, you know, how things have evolved in Colombia, because Mexico has many similar trends in what has become the fight against corruption. And I think what resounds most is Todd's comment that all really boils down to political will. And it is clear that here in Mexico, political will has been lacking and perhaps focused in a different anti-corruption type, different type of anti-corruption policy than what we had been seeing with a lot of hope coming out from the prior administration in terms of the Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción, the national anti-corruption system, which was kind of a very robust and elaborate piece of legislation or several statutes coming together. And so I think the point to reflect on, and going to Todd's point, you know, why hasn't there been that political will here in Mexico to really boost that very robust piece of legislation we had? And I think you know, there's many explanations, of course, but I think one of them is the current administration has perceived that legislation as as too complex, and with some reason. It is a very elaborate set of statutes that puts together federal statutes with local state statutes. As you know, we're a federal republic here in Mexico, so it's difficult to coordinate legislation at different levels to truly be effective. And I think that was something that made the current administration kind of hesitant in trying to pursue that type of enforcement. But experience has shown us that a similar framework, which is actually the one that is in place for the freedom of information kind of regulations here in Mexico, which is this framework was modeled quite closely and following the freedom of information legislation, has been very effective. So kind of my response to, at least a part to that question of why hasn't there been that political will, is this administration pretty much visualized this Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción as a too complex piece of legislation to manage, despite the experience that in some other instances, freedom of information had been very effective. And the administration tried to, to boil it down to a more manageable, more known type of enforcement structure, which is, direct prosecution, having having the federal prosecutor's office really take hold of enforcement, but results have been very meager. I have to say, if one looks at the report that was published by the specialized prosecution office for against corruption crimes, and I think that this goes to what Todd mentioned, the number of cases actually prosecuted has been striking low. Of a total of 1,600 cases, more or less, only 22 have really been taken, have been prosecuted, and a lesser number, the outcome of those, have been is still pending. We were still waiting for the tally of those 22. How many did actually end up in having the culprits punished? So it's what I wanted to share with you in this brief minutes is at least an explanation of why we're saying that the political will is lacking. This is only part of the explanation. I think obviously it's a multifaceted analysis, but at least this, from my perspective, this fear of putting into motion a very complex and also from a budget perspective, an expensive piece of machinery has been at least part of the explanation of why the government has backed out, with the set result of corruption still being an important problem in Mexico.
Thank you very much, Leonel. Very interesting. And Sergio Matos, please, from Peru.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, and on behalf of Rebasa Alcázar and Casas, I'm very honored to be here. As you can see on the report on the anti-corruption assessment, Peru has one of the strongest regulatory frameworks for combating corruption in the region, but we have some problems that are diminishing anti-corruption efforts. And I want to talk a little bit about these problems in the beginning of my presentation. I have identified three main issues, being the first one, the most important, as everybody here has stated, the lack of political will to strengthen institutions in charge of the anti-corruption efforts. As Todd mentioned, and I agree, it is just a rhetorical priority, but unfortunately, most of our former presidents are under investigation for corruption charges. One of them is currently living in California, waiting for his extradition trial to be finished. The second problem will be the lack of independence within the judiciary and the prosecutor's office. As also you can see on the report, almost 33% of judges and prosecutors, including some of the ones in charge of the most high profile and complex cases in Peru, are temporary. This have a negative impact on their impartiality and on their decisions that they provide. And although it's not the rule, there have been some abuses from the prosecutor's office. There are several individuals, including former presidents, under house arrest or preventive prisons, as Todd mentioned, but non-conviction. There is just one trial that just started, the one against former President Humala and his wife. Also, there have been some incorrect interpretations of some criminal offenses, for example, money laundering, to start criminal investigations. And this have made an impact on society's confidence in the anti-corruption system. And as Antonio mentioned, we have assessed the legislation, the regulatory framework. I want to talk about two crucial pieces of legislation. The first one being the law 30424, which is the law regulating criminal responsibility of the legal persons, legal entities, companies in Peru, which is in force in January 2018, and which allow to prosecute and sanction legal entities for crimes such as money laundering, corruptions, among others. What is happening, what have happened is that as of today, I'm not aware of a single case or sanction that applies this law. On the right side, this law has created an incentive for companies to design and implement criminal compliance programs. There is no obligation in Peru, as I think I heard in Colombia, to implement compliance programs. In Peru, it's just an incentive, because companies can be exempted from sanction if they have implemented a compliance program before the crime is committed. And nowadays, there is a bill to amend this law to extend the scope of criminal offenses by which companies could be charged. This includes private corruption, which is a good news, environmental offenses, tax evasion, and illegal political financing. Also, which could be interesting for the US audience, this amendment is attempting to apply this piece of legislation to the foreign parent companies of the Peruvian companies that has committed the crime. So it's a bit like the FCPA. But unfortunately, this bill also diminished the importance of the opinion from the regulatory agency about the effectiveness or efficiency of the compliance program. The second piece of legislation that I want to talk about is the one that happened after the start of the Lavallato case or explosion here in Peru, because until that moment in 2016, the Criminal Procedural Code didn't allow companies to enter an NPA, a non-prosecutor agreement, but this was changed as a result of this case. And this has brought many positive results, among them the agreement within the prosecutor's office and Odebrecht and other construction companies in Peru. But nowadays, the Congress is discussing a bill to make some changes to this NPA process. They want to set up a one-year deadline for the NPA procedure to conclude. In other words, as many of you know, during an NPA procedure, the prosecutor needs to corroborate or verify the information provided by the company, which is the defendant, before granting any advantage or benefit to the company. And this takes a lot of time and resources. So nowadays there is no deadline, but the Congress wants to set up a one-year deadline since the NPA started. And after that deadline, if the NPA is not concluded, any statement provided by the defendant within the NPA is not longer valid. This has received a lot of criticism, mainly because some people believe, and I agree, unfortunately, that this is motivated by political reasons, because the majority of political Peruvian leaders are investigated either by corruption charges or money laundering. And also the majority of these cases have started due to a statement provided during a non-prosecutor agreement procedural. So what to do, which are the recommendations that we arrive along with the Lawyer Civil Council in the assessment, is that Peruvian authorities need to appoint more judges and prosecutors after a thorough selection process. I know, in fact, that the Lawyers Council have been involved in this effort. The second recommendation will be to provide training on to prosecutors and judges, not only on anti-corruption matters, but also on complex financial matters. And this could sound weird, but today's high-level corruption cases in Peru and also money laundering cases in Peru are filled with terms such as SPVs, SPA, bonds, and unfortunately, authorities are lost among those concepts they do not understand, and this has led to some mistakes in many investigations. And I believe this is not their fault. They were not trained for this, neither did we, but they should, if they want to identify and sanction the real culprits in these cases. And finally, as is stated in the anti-corruption assessment published by the Lawyers Civil Council, there are mechanisms in Peru to report corruption within the public and private sector, but unfortunately, nobody uses them. People are afraid, and this requires a real culture change, and this starts from the top of the government and the top of the companies. So that will be all on my behalf. Thank you for the invitation and your attention.
Thank you very much, Adriana, Leonel, and Sergio, for these important contributions. Moving on to the second part of this discussion, to authorities, I have 3 points I want to highlight. The first one is and I want to highlight it again because it's very important. The lack of political will is one of the main challenges for anti-corruption efforts, including providing institutions with independence and sufficient resources. In some cases, this happens because authorities want to maintain the status quo on purpose, and sometimes because they have regressive policies. The second point is that a common element in the region is a lack of capacity of criminal prosecution and justice institutions to deal with cases of great corruption and complex financial schemes due to a lack of understanding and training. And third is that in some countries, the lack of independence of autonomous powers or institutions, particularly the judiciary and prosecutors, is a matter of concern. Factors identified for this lack of independence are, in addition to political will, political and non-merit-based mechanisms to appoint judges and prosecutors, lack of financial and human resources, lack of training, and lack of technological tools to carry out their functions. We're gonna hear from Hernán Pérez Luz from Ecuador, Alfonso Carrillo from Guatemala, Ali Ordóñez from Honduras, and Igal Gertein from Uruguay. Thank you so much for your participation. Hernán.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for my delay joining this meeting, and I thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. Yeah, I want just to add a couple of things about corruption that perhaps sometimes is not addressed. One is, I think, the lack of, I would say, to keep one of the problems that I feel that we have here in Latin America and Ecuador especially is that the lack of sophistication of our laws with regard to the new ways of corruption. Our civil law tradition and our, in general, legal tradition has been developed, taking as a model situations that are no longer in place in the current world. Today, corruption is going very fast, very sophisticated, very globalized. And our systems, our legal system, are still very, state-centered, very developed under a different paradigm. That's one of the things that I have seen many times here in Ecuador. And the second point I want to make is something that perhaps is overlooked in this when we talk about corruption, is the unfortunately role played by lawyers. Attorneys in Ecuador in general, and I don't know if I can speak for other countries, are not as a profession that is not well regulated. Here in Ecuador, it's very common, unfortunately. Attorneys, under the guise of protecting and defending a client, are becoming or are part of the criminal scheme. Unfortunately, we don't have this enough independence of the bar, independence of the legal community to somehow resist these practices from our colleagues. I have seen many times. I have seen many very close where the attorneys are part of the corruption scheme, and they just are assistant to criminal situations. I know that this is not the only that happens in other part of the world. The difference is that in Ecuador and perhaps in many Latin American, there are no rules, there are no sanctions, there are no consequences for attorneys that are part of the criminal proceeding. So this is, I want just to point out, and I think that we should take it into account when we talk about this issue. I think that I remember that when we visited a couple of years ago Guatemala, and we talked about this, and it was very interesting to see that the talk about the rules regarding the conduct of attorneys was somehow absent in this discussion. So this is something that I just wanted to bring, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Alfonso?
Muy buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a privilege to be here again. Even a continuation of what we spoke last year. Voy a hablar en español, ya que me dicen que la mayoría de nuestros oyentes son de habla hispana. Para entender lo que está pasando en el 2021, 2022 en Guatemala, debemos entender CICIG. La Comisión contra la Impunidad estuvo en Guatemala de 2007 a 2019. Hizo una labor extraordinaria. Más de 500 autoridades detenidas, expresidentes, presidente, vicepresidente, ministros, presidentes del Banco Central, presidentes del Instituto de Seguridad Social. Y sí, con un grupo de investigadores internacionales y con el apoyo extraordinario de Telma Aldana como fiscal general, de Juan Francisco Sandoval como el jefe de la Fiscalía Especial contra la Impunidad, hicieron una labor extraordinaria. Una labor extraordinaria que en 2018 el presidente Morales viene a desmontar junto con grupos de interés y con todos esos grupos que habían sido afectados por la labor de CICIG. Luego en 2019 finalmente sale CICIG. Y en estos últimos 2 años realmente lo que ha pasado es que se ha agravado la situación. Quisiera decir que estamos mejor. No, estamos mucho peor. El presidente Yamatei, con el apoyo de la fiscal general, han venido básicamente a desmantelar y a atacar y perseguir a los que eran los fiscales de la Fiscalía Especial contra la Impunidad a tratar de borrar y arrasar con todo lo que se hizo bueno en el pasado y afectar la memoria de la ciudadanía guatemalteca, que incrédula está viendo todo esto, que no termina de comprender la complejidad de lo que está sucediendo, porque cuando en el 2018 Morales comienza y ahora continúa con el presidente Jean Matei, crean una máquina de desinformación, crean grupos, personas, utilizadas simplemente para bombardear a la ciudadanía con ciertas ideas. La labor extraordinaria de CICIG y de FESI está en la mente de la gente que está consciente de la importancia de la corrupción y la importancia del daño que le han hecho a nuestro país. Este último año ha habido una persecución increíble que hizo que el fiscal Juan Francisco Sandoval finalmente tuviera que salir del país. Han prácticamente desmantelado FESI, están bloqueando las investigaciones, intimidando a todo aquel que trata de hacer algo bien. Han iniciado acciones penales contra los exfuncionarios de CICIG y de FESI que pueden, al punto que podemos decir que coordinadamente la fiscal general y toda la gente que opera bajo su control, la Corte de Constitucionalidad, mediante sanciones donde reduce las penas de muchos delitos por la corrupción, 67 delitos de la corrupción fueron reducidas las penas por la Corte de Constitucionalidad. La Corte Suprema de Justicia y la Corte de Constitucionalidad también protegiendo, dándole inmunidad a pícaros, a corruptos y tratando de perjudicar a los pocos funcionarios increíblemente valientes que tenemos en el país, particularmente alguien como la jueza Aifán, Juan Francisco Sandoval y muchos otros valiosos fiscales y miembros de nuestras instituciones que pelearon y que se desvelaron y pasaron mucho tiempo peleando para lograr los resultados que se obtuvo en Guatemala. Un Congreso de la República que también, de común acuerdo con el presidente, con la fiscal general, con las cortes, que han emitido leyes nuevamente para favorecer a unos pequeños grupos, para favorecer a los corruptos. Estamos pasando una etapa transitoria donde digamos que los corruptos están teniendo buenos éxitos y resultados desde su perspectiva, fatales para nuestra ciudadanía, fatales para la batalla contra la corrupción, pero donde la población y la ciudadanía está observando qué está sucediendo, qué se necesita en el país. Cuando no hay voluntad política, in absence of political will, diríamos, lo único que nos queda es la demanda ciudadana, el despertar de la ciudadanía y decir ya no más. Un alto hasta aquí. No puede seguir siendo esto de esta manera. No basta una sociedad civil aglutinada. Se requiere que la conciencia social demande un cambio. Y tarde o temprano eso va a venir. El fiscal que hoy, igual que su secretario y magistrados de las cortes, han sido incluidos en la lista Ángel, tarde o temprano van a pagar por lo que están haciendo. Pero eso va a requerir que nuestra ciudadanía termine de entender y tener la conciencia para despertarse y reaccionar. Es inaceptable lo que está sucediendo. Están arrasando y destruyendo la institucionalidad poca que tenía el país, que había logrado construir CICIG y una serie de guatemaltecos que habían hecho grandes sacrificios en la Fiscalía y en la Fiscalía Especial contra la Impunidad, particularmente en las Cortes. Todavía la jueza Erika Aifán está siendo objeto de grandes acosos. Jóvenes fiscales que tendrán que tener el coraje, colegas abogados que tendrán que despertar a la realidad y ante todo el apoyo de una comunidad internacional que nos ayude a informar a la ciudadanía. No es bueno el reporte, pero es una etapa y es una etapa donde vale la pena aprender de lo que está sucediendo. El poder gubernamental siendo usado contra la ciudadanía para promover la corrupción y proteger a los corruptos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Alfonso. We have Ali Ordóñez from Honduras. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists and to the rest of the audience present. It is a real and true privilege to share with you today. On behalf of BLP Honduras, I thank the New York City Bar Association for the invitation. So let's get started. Let us talk about Latin America and its biggest problem, corruption. That scourge that we criticize so much, that affects us so much but does not go away. That monster that generates lack of opportunities, migration, social disintegration, criminality, and poverty that seems never to be satisfied despite leaving the souls of all citizens helpless. People will see it and wonder, why doesn't our country move forward? Why does the political class claim to be different when in reality they are all the same? Why do we never see real progress in our land? And for young people, why am I so excited about the idea of going abroad to study and never coming back? Will my future be there? So many questions and so few answers, but we could summarize it in just one: the lack of mitigation of the effects of corruption. Honduras, a country which has a broad legislation in anti-corruption matters, regulations such as the Constitution of the Republic, the law on transparency and access to public information, and the benevolent and recently approved criminal code in 2017 stand out among the most important legislation on this particular matter. But why not apply the sanctions that our legislation already establishes? Here can we address some points in particular. Number one, lack of institutionality. The mechanisms and tools to prosecute the crime to the detriment of the public administration already exist. The will to do so? No. This is due to the enormous interference of the political sector and the functioning of state institutions, which creates inequality, injustice, and impunity. Two, lack of public ethics and integrity of the state authorities. Honduras already has a code of ethical conduct of the public servant, which is of strict compliance for anyone who provides services to the public administration. However, in practice, we can see many officials who cannot fulfill their functions if it is not with prior research optimization of public administration or bribe. Three, lack of political will. It is very common that in the middle of a political campaign prior to elections, politicians are flag bearers of the fight against corruption, since it is the easiest to raise but the most difficult to practice. Once in power, I would like to evaluate their integrity in the fulfillment of the fight they claim to lead. On the other hand, in the report, you will be able to observe a topic that is necessary to mention: the denunciation and protection of whistleblowers, where the legal community consulted considers that the means and mechanisms to denounce acts of corruption in general are accessible. Although the witness protection program administered by the Public Prosecutor's Office exists on paper, citizens prefer to remain silent rather than endanger their lives or those of their families, thanks to the inefficiency of the state apparatus in terms of this protection program. This element leads us to a cause of impunity in the country, and it is the lack of denunciation in view of the little security offered to the whistleblower and the lack of denunciation culture within our society. It is necessary to create the spaces of trust and security that ensure the protection of the whistleblowers, and it is necessary to protect the independence of the functioning of the institution of the prosecution of the crime. Specifically, the Latin American Anti-Corruption Assessment in Honduras accredits the important legal framework that the country has, the participation of the international community in anti-corruption issues, such as the mission of support against corruption and impunity in Honduras, MASI. The authorities empowered to prevent, investigate, or punish acts of corruption, institutional coordination mechanisms, transparency, and access to public information, among other elements that were studied to conclude that is necessary. Promote the strengthening of public ethics and integrity mechanisms for public officials and public servants. Strengthen the whistleblowers protection system reinforce the institutionalism and independence of the entities in charge of preventing, investigating, and sanctioning acts of corruption. But what can we as citizens do? Learn our rights, demand from any position in which we find ourselves transparency, access to public information, and ethics in any sphere. But above all, exercise our right to citizen participation, get more involved in politics in order to sustain our rule of law in participatory democracy. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ali. We have Igal.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes para todos, o buenas noches. Muchas gracias al Centro y al Bar de la Ciudad de Nueva York por permitirme el honor de participar en esta charla y discusión. Bien, en Uruguay, a diferencia de los otros países de Latinoamérica, y esto también se ve reflejado en los elevados índices, las posiciones altas que sale Uruguay en todos los rankings, la corrupción no es endémica ni estructural, ni tiene la notoriedad pública que tuvo en otros países del continente. Esto no es un hecho aislado, sino que también está en relación con que Uruguay aparezca en las posiciones más altas de los rankings de democracia, el respeto del Estado de Derecho y las libertades individuales. A nivel de corrupción, esto también permite que los ciudadanos puedan acceder a canales fáciles para denunciar los diferentes actos de corrupción. Si bien la legislación anticorrupción necesita modernizarse y ampliar en algunos aspectos, el marco jurídico en Uruguay se considera que es suficiente, sobre todo en el sector público, en donde existe un código de ética de la función pública que regula los patrones o parámetros a los que se tienen que ajustar los funcionarios públicos, regula también cómo manejar y gestionar los posibles conflictos de interés, así como políticas en materia de regalos, obsequios que reciben estos funcionarios, y también hay programas de capacitación para los funcionarios públicos para prevenir la corrupción. Asimismo, diferentes disposiciones regulan qué funcionarios se encuentran obligados a presentar declaraciones juradas de bienes e ingresos, y dependiendo de la clase de funcionario que sea, también va a variar el grado de publicidad de esta información. Asimismo, los funcionarios públicos que denuncian actos de corrupción se encuentran amparados por un estatus protector, y es fácil acceder a la información pública salvo las limitaciones que establece la ley, y en caso de que no se otorgue esa información, hay posibilidad de acudir a la vía jurisdiccional para obtener el acceso a la información. Como puntos a mejorar en el sector público, sería bueno que el marco jurídico regule la situación de los funcionarios públicos en forma posterior a que dejan sus empleos, principalmente a qué trabajos pueden acceder en el sector privado, y asimismo, si bien existe una publicidad en materia de contratación pública, tendría que ampliarse la publicidad de la misma para tener mayores garantías. A nivel del sector privado, en Uruguay no existe, como a diferencia del sector público, un marco jurídico anticorrupción en forma genérica. En el pasado existió algún intento de proyectos de ley que regularan esta materia, pero por diferentes motivos no fue sancionado. A pesar de eso, en Uruguay existe un amplio marco normativo en materia de prevención del lavado de activos y financiamientos del terrorismo, así como también identificación de beneficiarios finales y diferentes tipos de accionistas. Y lo que no tiene Uruguay, a diferencia de otros países de la región, es la regulación de la responsabilidad penal de las personas jurídicas. Como aspectos a mejorar en el sector privado sería lograr aprobar un marco jurídico que regule la actividad y que regule la corrupción en este sector, así como crear incentivos para denunciar los posibles actos de corrupción que se den. A nivel de las autoridades y organismos que actúan en el combate de la corrupción, en Uruguay son muy variados. Tenemos órganos que se encuentran sometidos a la tutela administrativa del Poder Ejecutivo, pero a pesar de eso son independientes a la hora de investigar, detectar y sancionar los actos de corrupción. En Uruguay el poder que tiene más importancia en esta lucha contra la corrupción es el Poder Judicial, y en Uruguay es sumamente independiente porque Uruguay respeta el principio de separación de poderes en forma rígida. Por otra parte, si bien no existe ninguna prohibición a que la sociedad civil participe en temas de anticorrupción, sería interesante que la legislación dé mayores incentivos para que la sociedad civil en conjunto participe en esta materia. Pero lo que yo quería destacar con mayor énfasis es el rol de Uruguay como una suerte de paraíso en esta región en materia de corrupción, y esto sin dudas tiene que ver con el apegado respeto, como mencioné al principio, que existe al Estado de Derecho, a las libertades individuales y a la tradición, a la profunda tradición democrática que tiene Uruguay. Bueno, ha sido un gusto, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Hernan, Alfonso, Ali, and Nigal, for these very interesting and important contributions. Moving on to implementation, I have 5 brief points. The first one is that the legal community identifies that most prevention mechanisms in the public sector are formally created, but are deficient and ineffective. Second is that in half of the countries analyzed, there is a lack or inadequacy of existing mechanisms for protecting whistleblowers. Third, in most countries where there is a criminal or administrative responsibility for legal entities, the legal community is not aware of investigations or rulings punishing corruption. Four, the lack of coordination mechanisms between authorities was also mentioned in some countries as one of the obstacles to the proper implementation of the legal framework. And 5, there are several barriers for civil society organizations' participation in anti-corruption efforts. In some countries, action have been taken to close the civic space and prevent civil society from investigating or denouncing acts of corruption. We will now hear from Ignacio Megilario from Argentina, Lindsay Sykes from Bolivia, Eloy Rizzo from Brazil, Juan Carlos Tristan from Costa Rica, and Mari Fernandez from the Dominican Republic. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Jamie. First, I want to thank the Band Center and the New York City Bar for this such a great work, which is an annual report, the update of the report, the organization of this panel annually. For me, it's a pleasure to be part of this every year, and mainly to thanks to all the contributors around the Latin America, and especially to Jamie and to Antonia for such great job. Well, now I will turn to Spanish because I think that most of the audience is Spanish speaker, so I think it's going to be much easier. So, hablando un poco de Argentina y los resultados del reporte por el año 2021, lo que tiene que ver con Argentina, lamentablemente no hubieron muchos cambios o avances respecto al año anterior. Argentina tiene algo muy característico, que es un marco normativo en materia de anticorrupción bastante sólido, y un marco normativo básicamente que tomó mayor fuerza y mayor seriedad a partir del año 2017. En el año 2017 en nuestro país se tomaron con mayor seriedad algunas recomendaciones que Argentina tenía que seguir y tenía que implementar en el marco de los compromisos asumidos con la OCDE, ¿no? En el marco del Tratado de la Lucha contra la Corrupción de funcionarios públicos en transacciones comerciales internacionales, y en ese marco se terminaron de consolidar algunos aspectos. Por eso en 2017, por ejemplo, Argentina implementó su ley de responsabilidad penal de las personas jurídicas, hubo mayor alineamiento con las recomendaciones de la OCDE en este tema. En los procesos licitatorios, por ejemplo, se reforzaron muchas pautas de transparencia para presentarse en licitaciones o contratos con el Estado o contratos con el gobierno, e inclusive se exigía a todos los jugadores privados que se presentaban a licitaciones, por ejemplo, públicas, sólidos estándares de integridad o compliance para poder presentarse y participar y no tener ningún antecedente en materia de corrupción como una cuestión fundamental. También tuvo un rol bastante relevante en la oficina anticorrupción, una oficina donde se empezó a tener mayor actividad, mayores facultades justamente para combatir la corrupción, y eso también se fue palpable con algunos resultados. Por ejemplo, a partir de ese año Argentina empezó a estar un poco mejor posicionada en los rankings de percepción de corrupción que da Transparency International todos los años. Bueno, todos esos avances que se habían logrado, lo que se registra en los últimos años es alguna suerte de estancamiento o retrocesos, ¿no? Estancamientos o retrocesos que ya no tiene mucho sentido adjudicárselos a la pandemia, al COVID y a la situación de confinamiento o parate general de la actividad del Estado. El primer indicio de esto fue, por ejemplo, en el año 2021, digamos, el año donde se hace el reporte, se le sacan algunas facultades a la Oficina Anticorrupción. Y lo que se dice es, la Oficina Anticorrupción ya no va a investigar más proactivamente casos de corrupción de funcionarios públicos, sino que la Oficina de Corrupción va a focalizarse en su rol preventivo, ¿no? Va a tratar de tomar medidas políticas o distintos procedimientos para evitar situaciones de corrupción, pero no va a tener más un rol de, como si fuese un fiscal en materia de corrupción, de investigar proactivamente casos y llevarlos a la justicia. Entonces, en 2021 ya una primera nota negativa es un nuevo rol que se le da a la Oficina Anticorrupción en este tema. También se vio eso en los procesos licitatorios, entonces estas exigencias que se venían incorporando a jugadores privados, locales e internacionales para poder adjudicarse un contrato, una licitación con el Estado, todos esos requisitos pasaron a ser cada vez más flexibles o hasta casi desaparecer en algunos procesos, por lo cual ahora sería un poco lo mismo ser un jugador privado que quiere un contrato con el Estado, tenga antecedentes de corrupción o no tenga. Años anteriores eso estaba mucho más rígido. Y eso también tuvo resultados, ¿no? Porque, por ejemplo, en el índice de corrupción de Transparency International, Argentina fue estando en una posición un poco peor de lo que había logrado estar años anteriores. Entonces, todos son resultados palpables. Y todo básicamente se atribuye un tema de enforceability, porque como empecé diciendo y como se muestra en el reporte, Argentina tiene un marco normativo bastante grande y sólido en materia anticorrupción, ley de responsabilidad penal de las personas jurídicas, ley de ética pública, etcétera, etcétera, etcétera. Digamos, hay mucho marco normativo que está, pero que es un poco una letra muerta. Y eso está muy palpable porque, por ejemplo, en el año 2017, que tenemos la ley de responsabilidad penal de las personas jurídicas en Argentina, no registramos ni siquiera un antecedente, no hay ni siquiera un fallo de ninguna autoridad judicial que sancione a alguien o que atribuya algún tipo de responsabilidad a algún jugador privado por haber estado involucrado en un hecho de corrupción con un funcionario público. Entonces, este ya es un red flag, es un indicador que demuestra un poco que la ley es un poco una letra muerta, ¿no? Y después, no sé si se escucha, la oficina donde estoy hablando ahora está justo pegado donde estuvo la Embajada de Israel en Argentina. Mañana, 17 de marzo, son 30 años de que tuvimos en Argentina ese atentado contra la Embajada de Israel. Hay un poco de ruidos porque hay una serie de eventos en conmemoración de ese día, pero la verdad que este ruido no es menor justo en esta charla acá, porque pasaron 30 años de un caso bastante emblemático y bastante gravoso para toda la sociedad, un atentado contra la Embajada de Israel que dejó además de muchos muertos y muchos daños a todos, ¿no? Sea comunidad judía o no sea comunidad judía, tiene 30 años de impunidad, y una impunidad muy marcada por la intromisión del poder político en el poder judicial. Entonces, esta información no es menor, porque como tenemos este caso, digamos, de la Embajada de Israel en Argentina, tenemos muchas causas de corrupción, o muchas causas que tienen algún punto de conexión con situaciones de corrupción o intromisión del poder político en la actividad judicial. Por lo cual, otro problema que nosotros tenemos en la enforceability de políticas o marcos normativos en materia de corrupción es la independencia del poder judicial. Entonces, acá es un tema bastante serio, en definitiva, porque nos ponemos en jaque, nos ponemos a discutir bases del sistema republicano que tiene Argentina, como la mayoría de las democracias de la región, principios constitucionales y principios que están en un montón de acuerdos internacionales que Argentina adhirió y forma parte. Y por último, otro tema para no tomar mucho tiempo, que tiene que ver con la información pública, digamos. Otro problema u otra cuestión que nos imposibilita a tener un sistema anticorrupción efectivo en Argentina. Tenemos muchos problemas identificar o obtener información pública de funcionarios públicos y poder hacer un assessment acertado y poder identificar supuestos de corrupción o no corrupción, ¿no? Entonces, esto sigue siendo un problema, una traba. Y la verdad que esto es más grande, ¿no? Porque en definitiva, en la información pública está el primer punto para donde, digamos, de un procedimiento o de una línea de tiempo en la cual se puede terminar detectando un caso de corrupción. Sin tener acceso a esa información no podemos tener un primer indicio, o no podemos obtener, un primer indicio de algo que nos lleva a concluir que pudo haber o no un caso de corrupción en Argentina. Y acá, y para cerrar, lo que quiero citar sobre esto es un informe de Poder Ciudadano, que es una organización no no gubernamental en Argentina, que, bueno, su foco justamente es la integridad y la transparencia y la división de los poderes del Estado y cómo funciona eso, que resalta en su último informe, en su informe también del 2021, el problema que tiene Argentina con el acceso a la información pública. Y quiero compartirles a ustedes una quotation muy cortita que dice que sin acceso a la información pública no hay transparencia. Sin transparencia no existe la rendición de cuentas, y sin rendición de cuentas no existe la integridad. Es decir, que no se pueden prevenir irregularidades, detectar riesgos y mucho menos sancionar delitos contra las administraciones públicas, delitos que no son otra cosa que lesiones graves al bien común. Y esto lo resume todo, ¿no? Entonces, recapitulando un poco y para cerrar, ¿cuál es el problema de Argentina o cómo está parado Argentina frente a la corrupción? Está parado con un marco normativo sólido, muy amplio, pero con muchas deficiencias en enforceability, dado por el acceso a la información pública y dados principalmente por la independencia del Poder Judicial. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Ignacio. We can, Lindsay.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you to the Vance Center for the invitation, and congratulations to the Lawyers Council and all of the collaborators who helped contribute to this important report. Regarding Bolivia, Bolivia is a great example of a case where on paper, it looks great in terms of the fight against corruption. Bolivia has implemented a lot of legislation to fight against corruption. And the reality is something different. So I wanted to highlight the contrast, how good Bolivia looks on paper with the reality of the fight against corruption on the ground in practice. Bolivia, became part, the state of Bolivia started manifesting its desire to fight against corruption by becoming part of the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption back in 1997. It then became part of the UN Convention Against Corruption in 2005. Bolivia promulgated a new constitution in 2009. And in that new constitution actually exists the duty for every citizen to fight against corruption and to denounce acts of corruption. And corruption crimes are also the only crimes that may be prosecuted retroactively. So it's demonstrating the state's very strong commitment to this effort. And following the new constitution, Bolivia in 2010 promulgated its own domestic anti-corruption law, which is very much in line with international standards. It criminalizes active and passive bribery, bribery of local and foreign officials. And I think it's interesting because this is a question we get a lot from potential investors or people who want to do business in Bolivia. People want to know, do you have a local anti-corruption law? And the answer is yes. And generally that's met with a positive response, like that's the right answer. And people in general take that as a signal that, okay, this country is committed to anti-corruption efforts and the risk of corruption should be lower here. And I think what this report demonstrates, and not just for Bolivia, but in other places too, that the existence of this very strong anti-corruption legislation does not, unfortunately, necessarily translate into less corruption, right? Prosecutions, similar to the Peruvian and Mexican cases that our colleagues have spoken about, there have been very few prosecutions under this anti-corruption legislation, and the prosecutions that have existed have largely been inconclusive. The great majority of the cases are just stalled, status not advancing, and the few convictions that have come about have been in very egregious cases where it was politically inviable to do nothing, right? One case, for example, was where someone was literally caught red-handed with a briefcase with $500,000 cash, just to give you an example. So that's kind of the level of egregiousness that would be necessary, that has been in the past necessary to move a corruption case along in Bolivia. And another interesting fact about Bolivia is that Bolivia is still continuing on in terms of promulgating new legislation in this area and new legislation that is in line with international standards. So just last year, it promulgated a law that for the first time establishes criminal responsibility for corruption crimes for companies, right? And other colleagues have mentioned that this also exists in other countries in Latin America. I would say Bolivia is probably one of the countries who took the longest to do this. And part of this, and again, that was lauded as, oh, this is fantastic. Bolivia is passing legislation that's in line with international standards. And I think that it's positive in the sense that it does give local companies an incentive to implement compliance programs. A compliance program can be taken into account by the prosecutors as a mitigating factor. Something else that's interesting about this new law is it introduces the concept of colaboración eficaz, which is similar to a voluntary disclosure in the US, where you could, in theory, go into the prosecutor and disclose voluntarily a violation of corruption law. And I think it is interesting to consider whether this is possible to use this mechanism in a place where the public institutions are very weak. Is promulgating this legislation that's in line with international standards useful in a place where the institutions, similar to other cases we've heard about tonight, the prosecutors don't have the training or the resources to investigate and prosecute very complex and sophisticated cases. Are you really going to be able to go into that type of institution, which is widely regarded by many independent reports as not independent, and make use of this mechanism of voluntary disclosure? So I think Bolivia presents a very interesting case to look at in terms of contrasting what's on the paper, what's in the laws, with what's in the reality. And it really forces us to examine the question, is it reasonable to even expect that corrupt institutions are able to enforce anti-corruption laws? And I think that's a challenge for everyone. And I will conclude my comments there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. We have now Eloy Rizzo.
Right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Eloy Rizzo. I'm the head of the compliance and investigations practice at Demarest Advogados in Brazil. It's such a great honor to be here learning about the challenges the other panelists are facing and the work they have been performing in the fight against corruption in their countries. Initiatives like this one really give me hope and energy to keep working. I wish I was here in the very same position I used to be in international panels during the car wash probe, proudly speaking about the massive and effective enforcement of the Brazilian anti-corruption legislation and the compliance revolution that had engulfed the country from mid-2014 onwards. In July 2021, during the event where the first assessment was launched, I had already addressed some setbacks in the enforcement in Brazil, and my feeling was that the situation would worsen. Unfortunately, I was right in my diagnosis, which, by the way, seems aligned with Drago Kos, the president of the OECD Working Group on Bribery, who announced late last year the unprecedented creation of a permanent group to closely monitor the situation in Brazil. Some of the main setbacks that led to such movement from the OECD are the following. The first one, the enactment of the abuse of authority law, which basically gives room for the conviction of prosecutors and judges, holding them personally accountable for potential abuses committed during their daily activities. I have spoken with several federal judges and prosecutors, and they are really concerned with this legislation and how it might be used against them. There's also the reshuffle of the Improbity Act, one of the most powerful legislations we have in Brazil to fight corruption to, first of all, demand evidence of a will misconduct, while the previous version of the legislation allowed convictions in situations in which there existed negligence of the government official. Also to reduce the statute of limitations, which according to some of the studies I was reading and I had access to, might lead to the dismissal of something around 40% of the ongoing improbity lawsuits, and also to exempt the application of the Improbity Act for political parties and unfortunately, we all know why. The third point that I would like to address, in August 2021, the reappointment of Brazilian Prosecutor General Augusto Arras for a further 2-year mandate. And it's interesting to know that Mr. Arras was the very first Brazilian Prosecutor General that was not in the shortlist federal prosecutors historically present to the president. Coincidentally or not, Mr. Arras was responsible for determining the shutdown of the well-known car wash task force. His decisions have been extremely aligned with the interests of the federal government, and he is frequently criticized by several of his peers. At last, but not less important, a ruling from the Supreme Federal Court recognizing the competence of the electoral courts to prosecute and educate crimes that relate to electoral crimes. As a result of such ruling, several car wash operation cases were annulled and will have to start from scratch. Important to emphasize that the electoral courts are not used at all to dealing with corruption cases and do not have staff to analyze them. As a result of this recent ruling, most of the ongoing cases will surpass the statute of limitation, resulting in impunity. To sum up, I do not believe there's a lack of anti-corruption legislation in the country. The problem we are facing right now is a coordinated movement from Brazilian authorities to exert control over the enforcement of anti-corruption legislations in the country, and regrettably, they have been successful in their movements. Those are the problems we are facing at the moment in Brazil, and I believe, and I strongly believe, that the civil society, private sector, independent press, and also the OECD have to work hard to pressure the Brazilian government to make it crystal clear that such recent setbacks will not be tolerated and may even prevent the country from fulfilling its dream to join the OECD. I hope to be back with this marvelous group for the third edition of the assessment with a much, much positive speech. But unfortunately, today there was nothing I can do.
Thank you very much, Eloy. We have now Juan Carlos Tristan from Costa Rica.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much to the Band Center for this invitation. It's always a pleasure sharing our thoughts on these topics, and mostly with the colleagues and friends that are joining us in this panel. And first and foremost, congratulations for putting together this piece of work, which I'm sure it's going to be very valuable for the entire legal community among the continent. Well, Costa Rica, I would say that since we joined the OECD a couple of years ago, the Congress has been approving several laws, and which ended up with the approval of, I would say, the landmark law in this specific topic, which is the law that imposes criminal liability for corporate entities for acts of corruption. And this entails also not only the local entities, but also foreign companies doing business in Costa Rica. This law imposes multi-million-dollar penalties and fines to the entities, as well as imprisonment for individuals. Among the other sanctions that I will not go deeper in these because we have very little time now, it's that among the innovations of the law, there's now an incentive for companies that has or implement a robust compliance program to obtain up to a 40% mitigation in sanctions, which has helped and encouraged Costa Rican companies to start creating and implementing compliance programs. This has helped, and also the government has increased the enforcement controls and the enforcement authorities. Between 2015 and 2019, the number of complaints that were raised towards the Anti-Corruption Prosecutor Office increased 5 times. And we've seen how it's increasing even more within the past 1 to 2 years. Also, Costa Rica has been generally performed pretty well in comparison with our neighboring countries in Latin America in the Anti-Corruption Perception Index. We've been ranked above the average in terms of the democracy political institutions right next to Chile and Uruguay, who are definitely some of the role models we all want to follow in the region. And now I would say that our framework or our legal situation has dramatically changed within the past 6 months. On June 2021, we started facing our own legal lavallato. We were not, none of the companies involved in lavallato were doing business in Costa Rica, and as of June 2021, the prosecutors launched this a very far-reaching investigation involving government officials and infrastructure construction companies, which they call it the Cochinilla case. They conducted 57 raids in one single day. They arrested 30 individuals between the principals and owners of the major construction companies and some government officials, and then some precautionary measures were finally imposed. This was a very heavy investigation conducted since 2018. The prosecutors estimated that there were at least $125 million misappropriated under this bribery scheme. And one of the funny things or interesting things is that they raised this not as a corruption investigation, but as an organized crime investigation, which allow under a new law, the new organized crime law, which provides a very broad capacity of investigation to the enforcement authorities that they do not have in a normal corruption. So they could easily seize assets, they could freeze bank accounts, they can intercept phone communications very easily. I believe for now, the fact that they did some arrests, and that the fact that there are still some people, very few people still under arrest, it's a good sign that the Costa Rican authorities might have done a strong case, and hopefully with strong evidence. And I believe this is for sure, this is the first case that is going to be actually enforced under the new criminal liability law for legal entities. So we are all expecting to see how it will work, and hopefully it will become a landmark case at the end, and not just a gross media scandal that it's what we all waiting to see what happens. So I believe that we've been doing a lot of progress in terms of the legal framework, and we are doing a lot of progress on the enforcement as well. It's still pending to see the final resolutions.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. And last but not least, we have Mary Fernandez from the Dominican Republic here in the New York City Bar Association. Thank you, Mary.
Well, good evening to all. I'm going to be brief because I know I'm the only one blocking the end of the seminar. The Dominican Republic punishes corruption at the constitutional level. It could be said that this legal framework is sufficient, although it could be significantly improved. Opportunities for improvement include the badly needed law for extinguishment of ownership rights, la ley de extinción de dominio, as well as the inclusion of certain types of crime in line with the times for punishing acts of corruption. The main challenges that we face are in the applicability of a legal framework include that the legislation and regulations are impractical. There is insufficient judicial independence, insufficient mechanisms for detecting and preventing corruption, inadequate economic and human resources for anti-corruption agencies, inadequate training for public officials, and poor security and discipline of the staff, and lack of interagency cooperation. From the perspective of the public sector, there are several preventive policies and practices for the public sector in terms of corruption. In the private sector, I have to say that unfortunately, there are none. However, legal persons can face administrative, criminal, and civil liability for acts of corruption. When we talk about complaints and protection of whistleblowers, well, it's simple, we have none. So that's it. In terms of specialized authorities, the authorities at the national level with powers to prevent and investigate or punish crimes are the Directorate of Ethics and Government Integrity of the Ministry of the Presidency, the Office of the Controller of the Republic, the Chamber of Accounts, the Attorney General's Office, and the Judiciary. Presently, anti-corruption authorities in general have the independence necessary to effectively prevent, investigate, and punish corruption. Presently, and I include that word again, the Office of the Attorney General of the Dominican Republic is the most effective authority in combating corruption. And this is due to the political will of the current president of the Dominican Republic. Unfortunately, there's no strong institutional design, so this could change with the change of a political will or the change of a president. The Chamber of Auditors is identified, on the contrary, as the least effective body in combating corruption. However, there is some hope because there is a new appointment of members, and we just have to hope that the main threats of division will not prevail and they will do a better job than what had been done before. In terms of institutions coordinating mechanisms, they are really not effective. The participation of the civil society, however, is very active. And I have to highlight specifically one that is called Participación Ciudadana, which is the national chapter of Transparency International. And this organization is a civil society organization that has been involved in the follow-up of the main corruption cases in the country, including the Odebrecht bribe scandal. And in terms of transparency and access to information, well, there is information about public officials working in public procurement processes, sanctioned public officials, sanctioned private entities, and public procurement processes which are public. Certain recommendations that we could make are to promote and strengthen the mechanisms of public ethics and integrity of the authorities of the states, with particular and detailed rules to discourage, detect, and punish practices of corruption in the public sector. Second, to promote the modernization of norms of public ethics and integrity to strengthen the prevention of conflicts of interest, external activities, and post-employment obligations. Third, to promote implementation of digital tools and technology for the prevention of acts of corruption. To promote a legal framework for the prevention of corruption in private sector enterprises. And finally, to establish mechanisms to disseminate information related to companies, to complaint mechanisms available in the general population and public servants. In sum, public will, as Todd said at the beginning, is at the essence of our fight against corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. I want to thank again our distinguished panelists and members of the Lawyers Council for their very interesting participations. The Lawyers Council will continue to convene the regional legal community and individual countries to support and lead these efforts. Thank you very much for your attention. Have a good night.
Thank you very much for inviting us. Good night.